Chapter 3 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 3. On the afternoon of the following day, Mr. Shackford was duly buried. The funeral, under the direction of Mr. Richard Shackford, who acted as chief mourner and was sole mourner by right of kinship, took place in profound silence. The carpenters, who had lost a day on Bishop's new stables, intermitted their sawing and hammering while the services were in progress. The steam was shut off in the iron mills, and no clinking of chisel was heard in the marble yard for an hour, during which many of the shops had their shutters up. Then, when all was over, the imprisoned fiend in the boilers gave a piercing shriek, the leather bands slipped on the revolving drums, the spindles leaped into life again, and the old order of things was reinstated, outwardly, but not in effect. In general, when the grave closes over a man, his career is ended. But Mr. Shackford was never so much alive as after they had buried him. Never before had he filled so large a place in the public eye. Though invisible, he sat at every fireside. Until the manner of his death had been made clear, his ubiquitous presence was not to be exercised. On the morning of the memorable day, a reward of $100, afterwards increased to $500, at the insistence of Mr. Shackford's cousin, had been offered by the Board of Selectmen for the arrest and conviction of the guilty party. Beyond this and the unsatisfactory inquest, the authorities had done nothing, and were plainly not equal to the situation. When it was stated, the night of the funeral, that a professional person was coming to Stillwater to look into the case, the announcement was received with a breath of relief. The person thus vaguely described appeared on the spot the next morning. To mention the name of Edward Taggett is to mention a name well known to the detective force of the great city lying 60 miles southwest of Stillwater. Mr. Taggett's arrival sent such a thrill of expectancy through the village that Mr. Leonard Tappleton, whose obsequies occurred this day, made his exit nearly unobserved. Yet there was little in Mr. Taggett's physical aspect calculated to stir either expectation or enthusiasm. A slender man of about 26, but not looking it, with overhanging brown mustache, sparse side whiskers, eyes of no definite color, and faintly accentuated eyebrows. He spoke precisely, and with a certain unembarrassed hesitation, as persons do who have two thoughts to one word, if there are such persons. You might have taken him for a physician, or a journalist, or the secretary of an insurance company, but you would never have supposed him the man who had disentangled the complicated threads of the great Barnaby Bank defalcation. Stillwater's confidence, which had risen into the 90s, fell to 0 at the sight of him. "Is that Taggett?" they asked. That was Taggett, and presently his influence began to be felt like a sea turn. The 3 Dogberries of the watch were dispatched on secret missions, and within an hour it was ferreted out that a man in a cart had been seen driving furiously up the turnpike the morning after the murder. This was an agricultural district. The road led to a market town, and teams going by in the early dawn were the rule and not the exception. But on that especial morning a furiously driven cart was significant. Jonathan Beers, who farmed the Jenks land, had heard the wheels and caught an indistinct glimpse of the vehicle as he was feeding the cattle, but with a reticence purely rustic had not been moved to mention the circumstance before. "Taggett has got a clue," said Stillwater under its breath. By noon Taggett had got the man, cart and all. But it was only Bluffton's son Tom, of South Millville, who had started in hot haste that particular morning to secure medical service for his wife, of which she had sorely stood in need, as 2 tiny girls in a willow cradle in South Millville now bore testimony. "I haven't been cutting down the population much," said Bluffton, with his wholesome laugh. Thomas Bluffton was well known and esteemed in Stillwater, but if the crime had fastened itself upon him, it would have given something like popular satisfaction. In the course of the ensuing 48 hours, 4 or 5 tramps were overhauled as having been in the neighborhood at the time of the tragedy, but they each had a clean story and were let go. Then one Durgin, a workman at Slocum's yard, was called upon to explain some half-washed-out red stains on his overalls, which he did. He had tightened the hoops on a salt pork barrel for Mr. Shackford several days previous. The red paint on the head of the barrel was fresh and had come off on his clothes. Dr. Weld examined the spots under a microscope and pronounced them paint. It was manifest that Mr. Taggett meant to go to the bottom of things. The bar-room of the Stillwater Hotel was a center of interest these nights. Not only the bar-room proper, but the adjoining apartment, where the more exclusive guests took their seltzer water and looked over the metropolitan newspapers. Twice a week a social club met here, having among its members Mr. Craggie, the postmaster, who was supposed to have a great political future, Mr. Pinkham, Lawyer Perkins, Mr. Whiddon, and other respectable persons. The room was at all times in some sense private, with a separate entrance from the street, though another door, which usually stood open, connected it with the main salon. In this was a long mahogany counter, one section of which was covered with a sheet of zinc perforated like a sieve, and kept constantly bright by restless caravans of large beer glasses. Directly behind that end of the counter stood a Gothic brass-mounted beer pump, at whose faucets Mr. Snelling, the landlord, flooded you 5 or 6 mugs in the twinkling of an eye, and raised the vague expectation that he was about to grind out some popular operatic air. At the left of the pump stretched a narrow mirror, reflecting the gaily colored wine-glasses and decanters which stood on each other's shoulders, and held up lemons, and performed various acrobatic feats on a shelf in front of it. The 4th night after the funeral of Mr. Shackford, a dismal southeast storm caused an unusual influx of idlers in both rooms. With the rain splashing against the casements and the wind slamming the blinds, the respective groups sat discussing in a desultory way the only topic which could be discussed at present. There had been a general strike among the workmen a fortnight before, but even that had grown cold as a topic. "That was hard on Tom Blufton," said Stevens, emptying the ashes out of his long-stemmed clay pipe, and refilling the bowl with cut Cavendish from a jar on a shelf over his head. Michael Hennessy sat down his beer-mug with an air of argumentative disgust, and drew one sleeve across his glistening beard. "Stevens, you have had as many minds as a weathercock, jist. Didn't you see yourself it looked mighty black for the lad when he was took?" "I might have said something of the sort," Stevens admitted reluctantly after a pause. "His driving round at daybreak with an empty cart did have an ugly look at first. And they, then—" "Not to anyone who knew Tom Blufton," interrupted Samuel Piggott, Blufton's brother-in-law. "The boy hasn't a bad streak in him. It was an outrage. Might as well have suspected Parson Langley or Father O'Meara." "If this kind of thing goes on," remarked a man in a corner with a patch over one eye, "both of them reverend gents will be hauled up, I shouldn't wonder." "That's so, Mr. Peters," responded Durgin. "If my respectability didn't save me, who's safe?" "Durgin is talking about his respectability. He's joking." "Look here, Dexter," said Durgin, turning quickly on the speaker. "When I want to joke, I talk about your intelligence." "What kind of a man is Taggett, anyhow?" asked Piggott. "You saw him, Durgin." "I believe he was at Justice Bemis's office the day Blufton and I was there, but I didn't make him out in the crowd. Shouldn't know him from Adam." "Stillwater's a healthy place for tramps just about this time," suggested somebody. 3 of 'em snaked in today." "I think, gentlemen, that Mr. Taggett is on the right track there," observed Mr. Snelling, in the act of mixing another Old Holland for Mr. Peters. "Not too sweet, you said? I feel in my bones that it was a tramp, and that Mr. Taggett will bring him yet." "He won't find him on the highway yonder," said a tall, swarthy man named Torini, an Italian. Nationalities clash in Stillwater. "That tramp is 1,000 miles from here." "So he is, if he has any brains under his hat," returned Snelling. "But they're on the lookout for him. The minute he pawns anything, he's gone." "Can't put up greenbacks or gold, can he? He didn't take nothing else," interposed Bishop, the veterinary surgeon. "Not jewelry nor nothing?" "There wasn't none, as I understand it," said Bishop, "except a silver watch. That was all snug under the old man's pillar." "Want to know!" ejaculated Jonathan Beers. "I opine, Mr. Craggie," said the schoolmaster, standing in the inner room with a rolled-up file of the Daily Advertiser in his hand, "that the person who removed our worthy townsman will never be discovered." "I shouldn't like to go quite as far as that, sir," answered Mr. Craggie, with that diplomatic suavity which leads to postmasterships and seats in the general court, and has even been known to oil a dull fellow's way into Congress. "I cannot take quite so hopeless a view of it. There are difficulties, but they must be overcome, Mr. Pinkham, and I think they will be." "Indeed, I hope so," returned the schoolmaster. "But there are cases, are there not, in which the problem, if I may so designate it, has never been elucidated, and the persons who undertook it have been obliged to go to the foot, so to speak." "Ah, yes, there are such cases, certainly. There was the Burdell mystery in New York, and later the Nathan affair. By the way, I've satisfactory theories of my own touching both. The police were baffled, and remain so. But, my dear sir, observe for a moment the difference. Mr. Pinkham raised one finger on the edge of a little round table and leaned forward in a respectful attitude to observe the difference. "Those crimes were committed in a vast metropolis affording 1,000 chances for escape, as well as offering 1,000 temptations to the lawless. But we are a limited community. We have no professional murderers among us. The deed which has stirred society to its utmost depths was plainly done by some wayfaring amateur. Remorse has already arrived upon him, if the police haven't. For the time being he escapes, but he is bound to betray himself sooner or later. If the right steps are taken, and I have myself the greatest confidence in Mr. Taggett, the guilty party can scarcely fail to be brought to the bar of justice, if he doesn't bring himself there." "Indeed, indeed, I hope so," repeated Mr. Pinkham. "The investigation is being carried on very closely." "Too closely," suggested the schoolmaster. "Oh dear, no," murmured Mr. Craggie. "The strictest secrecy is necessary in affairs of this delicate nature. If Tom, Dick, and Harry were taken behind the scenes," he added, with the air of one wishing to say too much, "the bottom would drop out of everything." Mr. Pinkham shrunk from commenting on a disaster like that, and relapsed into silence. Mr. Craggie, with his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat and his legs crossed in an easy, senatorial fashion, leaned back in the chair and smiled blandly. "I don't suppose there's anything new, boys," exclaimed a fat, florid man, bustling in good-naturedly at the public entrance, and leaving a straight, wet trail on the sanded floor from the threshold to the polished mahogany counter. Mr. Wilson was a local humorist of the Falstaffian stripe, though not so much witty in himself as the cause of wit in others. "No, Jimmy, there isn't anything new," responded Dexter. "I suppose you didn't hear that the old man done something handsome for me in his last will and testament?" "No, Jimmy, I don't think he's made any provision whatever for an almshouse." "Sorry to hear that, Dexter," said Wilson, absorbedly chasing a bit of lemon peel in his glass with the spoon handle. "For there isn't room for us all up at the town farm. How's your grandmother? Finds it tolerably comfortable?" They are a primitive, candid people in their hours of unlaced social intercourse in Stillwater. This delicate tu quoque was so far from wounding Dexter that he replied carelessly, "Well, only so. The old woman complains of too much chicken salad and hothouse grapes all the year round." "Mr. Shackford must have left a large property," observed Mr. Ward of the firm of Ward and Locke, glancing up from the columns of the Stillwater Gazette. The remark was addressed to Lawyer Perkins, who had just joined the group in the reading-room. "Fairly large," replied the gentleman crisply. "Any public bequests?" "None to speak of." Mr. Craggie smiled vaguely. "You see," said Lawyer Perkins, "there's a will and no will. That is to say, the fragments of what is supposed to be a will were found, and we are trying to put the pieces together. It is doubtful if we can do it. It is doubtful if we can decipher it after we have done it. And if we decipher it, it is a question whether the document is valid or not." "That is a masterly exposition of the dilemma, Mr. Perkins," said the schoolmaster warmly. Mr. Perkins had spoken in his courtroom tone of voice, with one hand thrust into his frilled shirt bosom. He removed this hand for a second, as he gravely bowed to Mr. Pinkham. "Nothing could be clearer," said Mr. Ward. "In the case, the paper is worthless. What then? I am not asking you in your professional capacity," he added hastily, for Lawyer Perkins had been known to send in a bill on as slight a provocation as Mr. Ward's. "That's a point. The next of kin has his claims." "My friend Shackford, of course," broke in Mr. Craggie. "Admirable young man. One of my warmest supporters." "He is the only heir at law as far as we know," said Mr. Perkins. "Oh," said Mr. Craggie, reflecting. "The late Mr. Shackford might have had a family in Timbuktu or the Sandwich Islands." "That's another point." "The fact would be a deuced unpleasant point for young Shackford to run against," said Mr. Ward. "Exactly." "If Mr. Lemuel Shackford," remarked Coroner Whidden, softly joining the conversation to which he had been listening in his timorous, apologetic manner, "has chanced in the course of his early seafaring days to form any ties of an unhappy complexion—" "Complexion is good," murmured Mr. Craggie. "Some Hawaiian lady?" "Perhaps that would be a branch of the case worth investigating in connection with the homicide. A discarded wife, or a disowned son, burning with a sense of wrong?" "Really, Mr. Whidden," interrupted Lawyer Perkins witheringly, "it is bad enough for my client to lose his life without having his reputation filched away from him. I will explain. I was merely supposing." "The law never supposes, sir." This threw Mr. Whidden into great mental confusion. As coroner, was he not an integral part of the law? And when, in his official character, he supposed anything, was not that a legal supposition? But was he in his official character now, sitting with a glass of lemonade at his elbow in the reading-room of the Stillwater Hotel? Was he or was he not a coroner all the time? Mr. Whidden stroked an isolated tuft of hair growing low on the middle of his forehead, and glared mildly at Mr. Perkins. "Young Shackford has gone to New York, I understand," said Mr. Ward, breaking the silence. Mr. Perkins nodded. "Went this morning to look after the real estate interests there. It will probably keep him a couple of weeks. The longer, the better. He was of no use here. Lemuel's death was a great shock to him, or rather the manner of it was." "That shocked everyone. They were first cousins, weren't they?" Mr. Ward was a comparatively new resident in Stillwater. "First cousins," replied Lawyer Perkins, "but they were never very intimate, you know." "I imagine nobody was ever very intimate with Mr. Shackford." "My client was somewhat peculiar in his friendships." This was stating it charitably, for Mr. Perkins knew, and everyone present knew, that Lemuel Shackford had not had the shadow of a friend in Stillwater, unless it was his cousin Richard. A cloud of mist and rain was blown into the bar-room as the street door stood open for a second to admit a dripping figure from the outside darkness. "What's blowed down?" said Durgin, turning round on his stool and sending up a ring of smoke which uncurled itself with difficulty in the dense atmosphere. "It's only some of Jeff Staver's nonsense." "No nonsense at all," said the newcomer, as he shook the heavy beads of rain from his felt hat. "I was passing by Welch's Court. It's as black as pitch out, fellows. When slap went something against my shoulder, something like wet wings. Well, I was scared. 'It's a bat,' says I. But the thing didn't fly off. It was still clawing at my shoulder. I put up my hand, and I'll be shot if it wasn't the foremast, jib sheet and all, of the old weathercock on the north gable of the Shackford house. Here you are." And the speaker tossed the broken mast, with the mimic sails dangling from it, into Durgin's lap. A dead silence followed, for there was felt to be something weirdly significant in the incident. "That's kinder ominous," said Mr. Peters interrogatively. "Ominous of what?" asked Durgin, lifting the wet mass from his knees and dropping it on the floor. "Well, sort of queer, then." "Where does the queer come in?" inquired Stevens gravelly. "I don't know, but I'm hit by it." "Come, boys, don't crowd a feller," said Mr. Peters, getting restive. "I don't take the contract to explain the thing, but it does seem some way droll that the old schooner should be wrecked so soon after what has happened to the old skipper. If you don't see it or sense it, I don't insist. What's yours, Denevan?" The person addressed as Denevan promptly replied with a fine sonorous English accent, "A mug and a half with a head on it, Snellen." At the same moment Mr. Craggie, in the inner room, was saying to the schoolmaster, "I must really take issue with you there, Mr. Pinkham. I admit there's a good deal in spiritualism which we haven't got at yet. The science is in its infancy. It is still attached to the bosom of speculation. It is a beautiful science, that of psychological phenomenon, and the spiritualists will yet become an influential class of—" Mr. Craggie was going to say voters, but glided over it, "persons. I believe in clairvoyance myself to a large extent. Before my appointment to the post office, I had it very strong. I've no doubt that in the far future this mysterious factor will be made great use of in criminal cases. But at present I should resort to it only in the last extremity. The very last extremity, Mr. Pinkham." "Oh, of course," said the schoolmaster deprecatingly. "I threw it out only as the merest suggestion. I shouldn't think of—you understand me." "It is beyond the dreams of probability," said Mr. Craggie, appealing to Lawyer Perkins, "that clairvoyance may eventually be introduced into cases in our courts." "They are now," said Mr. Perkins with a snort. "The police bring 'em in." Mr. Craggie finished the remainder of his glass of sherry in silence, and presently rose to go. Coroner Whidden and Mr. Ward had already gone. The guests in the public room were thinning out. A gloom, indefinable and shapeless like the night, seemed to have fallen upon the few that lingered. At a somewhat earlier hour than usual, the gas was shut off in the Stillwater Hotel. In the lonely house in Welch's Court, a light was still burning. End of Chapter 3.